Aloha everyone and good afternoon, and happy Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. My name is Crystal Ka'ai, and as the Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, as well as the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, I'm honored to welcome you to the 2022 AA and NHPI Data Equity Summit here at the White House. I want to start off by thanking our co-host, API Data, and the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, as well as Dr. Judy Monroe and the CDC Foundation for their tireless work to make today's event possible. And I also want to thank our colleagues in the White House, including Erica Moritsugu, as well as the members of our Federal Interagency Working Group for the White House Initiative who have joined us today. When President Biden signed Executive Order 14031 last May to create the White House Initiative and authorize the creation of the President's Advisory Commission on AA and NHPIs, he explicitly underscored the importance of data disaggregation for our diverse AA and NHPI communities. In fact, one of the key charges of both the initiative and our commission is to expand the collection and use of data disaggregation and to facilitate improved research on policy and program outcomes for our diverse AA and NHPI communities. In this executive order, the President also tasked our initiative with working in coordination with the Equitable Data Working Group that the President established on day one as part of his whole-of-government approach to advancing racial equity throughout the government. This commitment to institutionalizing equity across the federal government is deeply embedded in the work of our White House Initiative and is more important now than ever as our communities continue to recover from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic, which exacerbated so many longstanding inequities facing many of our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. Not only did we see disproportionate health and economic impacts due to the pandemic, but we have also seen a rise in anti-Asian hate over the course of the past 2.5 years due to misinformation and inflammatory rhetoric that wrongly associates Asian Americans with the virus. We know that in order to fully address the multitude of challenges facing our nation, that we need to prioritize working closely to ensure that the data that we are seeking through the federal government truly reflects the diverse needs of our country, and that we can truly be able to understand so many of the challenges that our diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities face. And so that is exactly what we are planning to do today through this inaugural Data Equity Summit. We are going to be hearing from tremendous leaders, both within the federal government as well as within our community-based organizations, who are going to be speaking to the diverse needs of our communities. We know that this is an extremely vibrant community comprised of over 50 distinct ethnicities that speak over 100 different languages and dialects. And so again, to be able to truly understand the needs and challenges that our communities face, we really need to ensure that the data being collected at all levels, including by our federal government, reflects the diversity of our needs and can better address our challenges so that we can micro-target interventions, programs, and funding to really ensure that all communities can equitably recover from this pandemic. So with that, I just want to thank all of you for joining us today, especially our viewers who are tuning in live via live stream. And with that, I next have the honor to introduce my incredible colleague, Erica Moritsugu, who serves as the Deputy Assistant to the President and the AA and NHPI Senior Liaison in the White House. We would not be able to do this work without her. So, Erica, I will turn it over to you.
Mahalo, Crystal. Aloha, y'all. Welcome to the White House. I'm Erica Moritsugu, Deputy Assistant to the President and our AA and NHPI Senior Liaison at the White House. I cannot thank you enough, all of the participants from the White House, federal agencies, and all of our national AA and NHPI thought leaders for your leadership and commitment to advancing data equity for AA and NHPI communities. As many of you know, WIAMPI was established by President Biden through the signing of Executive Order 14031 last May. The mission of WIAMPI is to give an ambitious whole-of-government agenda to advance equity, justice, and opportunity to AA and NHPI communities. One of the priority areas is to expand the collection and use of disaggregated data at the federal, state, and local level on AA and NHPI communities, and facilitate improved research on policy and program outcomes for AA and NHPI communities. The work that you'll be doing here today and in the future will help the administration achieve one of the main priorities for the American people, to be more inclusive and bring equity to all Americans. The recent passing of Secretary Norman Mineta should remind us that the dedication and sacrifices done in the now will always set a better future for the next generation. His legacy of public service and dedication to the community is why each of us is here today. As I travel around the country in person or by Zoom with individuals that comprise this rich and diverse community, I have learned that our shared dream and desire for a better life are based upon the common principle of compassion for others in our community. The AA and NHPI community is woven deeply into the American fabric, and each of our own journeys defines what it means to be an American. If the federal government is going to serve all Americans in an equitable manner, it will need the right data strategy so that it can best deliver all the necessary resources to the AA and NHPI community. Again, thank you for taking the time and commitment to helping the Biden-Harris administration and the AA and NHPI communities with this important initiative that will build a better future. Next, I'd like to introduce a special colleague and friend, Judy Monroe, President and CEO of the CDC Foundation. Judy.
Well, thank you, and greetings, everyone. I'm delighted to add my welcome to everyone, both virtually and in the room today on behalf of the CDC Foundation, and we're thrilled to partner with you today for today's summit and beyond. Data is the cornerstone of public health practice, and the CDC Foundation actively works to support CDC and other partners to assure that public health and social determinant of health data and research are effectively used to promote health equity. As an example, we partnered early in the pandemic back in 2020 with the Satcher Health Leadership Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine to help build the Health Equity Tracker, which aims to give a detailed view of health outcomes by race, ethnicity, sex, and other critical factors. The data aims to help identify, understand, and respond to health inequities in our communities in a way that will allow every person to live well and long from generation to generation. Through a partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we are helping to lead the strategies to repair equity and transform community health, or otherwise known as the STRETCH initiative, which aims to help state health agencies seize this moment to harness the long-awaited influx of funds to support health equity and to create effective cross-sector and cross-agency coordination at the state and community level to eliminate health inequities that have existed for a long time. But of course were exacerbated during the pandemic. Our tagline at the CDC Foundation is "Together our impact is greater." And I can tell you that our team wholeheartedly believes in this statement, and we incorporate this belief in all of the work that we do. Over the course of the pandemic, the CDC Foundation was specifically able to support 62 community-based organizations across the United States that support Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. Many of these CBOs worked on promoting vaccine equity and confidence, and were also, of course, facing the risk of racist violence stoked by fear and xenophobia. Yet, these communities did demonstrate their resilience, including those CBOs that incorporated the arts in their outreach. So we also support CBOs in other areas, such as HIV self-testing in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. So thanks for having me here today. It's a joy to join you and such a rich and important discussion on this topic that will take place today. So I'm now pleased to introduce our next speaker, Karthik Ramakrishnan. With the AAPI data. He's the founder and co-director.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you to everyone for being here today, and a special thanks to Crystal and Erica at the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, as well as the White House for the partnership today, and more generally in the important work of data equity. I'll be followed by Greg Orton from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, who's also been a strong and tireless champion for data equity and equity more generally for our communities as well as other communities. Yesterday, API Data released a report that builds in many ways on the important work of the Equitable Data Working Group that has been a high priority of the Biden administration. That report is something you can find online on our website today. And I'll just give a few high-level overview of some of those findings, and to really marvel at the kind of moment we're in, where there's a strong recognition that we cannot get to equity without data, good, accurate, timely data, and data that is co-designed with experts in community and in the research, in community organizations and among researchers more broadly. What a report does is to provide an overview of prior reports and activities that predate this administration, and then to dig a bit deeper into the Equitable Data Working Group, which you'll hear about soon, and the roadmap that they lay out. We then provide a landscape scan, including many of the agencies that you'll be hearing from today, in terms of what prior and current efforts have been. And we'd love to hear today in terms of what some of the future plans might be. Data disaggregation has been a priority for our community for a long time. But what we see is that our agenda has matured beyond that. And I'll say more about that in a second, including language support, the collection of data, the analysis of data, thinking about dissemination and accessibility of data, and more. In our report, we follow the framework of DNA, data, narrative, and action. So even as we highlight the importance of data, both quantitative and qualitative, it's important to have community voice also reflected in the work. And importantly, and we're really heartened to see this from the Biden administration, these aren't just reports with suggestive ideas. These are recommendations that are actionable. It's not just aspirational, that it's actionable with recommended budget items attached to them. Really heartening to see. In general, if you had to think of one phrase, what our report lays out, which we see so many others, both within government and outside of government, talking about, is a disaggregation plus agenda. Recognizing the importance of improving standards, but finding ways to go beyond the standards and also going beyond the data collection aspect to all of those other stages. You can read the report in terms of what some of those major recommendations are, but I'll just say it's just so remarkable to be here with the kind of talent that we have in this room. And our hope with the White House Initiative and so many other partners here in CAPA and others is to do this on an annual basis during Heritage Month, so that we have both a foundation that we can build on as well as a baseline that we can use to compare. What were we thinking a year ago? What have we been able to achieve? And what more remains to be done? So I'm hopeful that this is the first in a series of summits that we will have. And of course, all of the important work that has already gone underway and that will continue to take place between these annual summits. Thank you, everyone, and I'm now pleased to introduce Greg Orton from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans.
Thanks, Karthik. It's good to be with you all. It feels a little bit serious in here, and while it is a serious topic, we are amongst friends, so everyone can relax. Those of you who are joining us on the internet, thank you so much. It's good to see you online. But again, my name is Greg Orton. I'm the National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. We are the umbrella coalition of 38 of the largest Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander civil rights organizations in the country. And many years ago, when the coalition was first founded, it was all based on the idea that our communities had to band together, find a unified voice to be heard and more recognized here in DC. And I'd like to believe that the founders, if they saw it today, would be quite proud. And just take for a moment stock of this room. I mean, it's rather incredible to have this many government officials here with expertise in the respective work that they do, the White House itself and its support for this event, and then, of course, our community leaders who bring their brilliance every day and have allowed us to get to this point in the maturity of our advocacy, the quality of our work, and also continuing to be committed to seeing the job done. When it comes to data disaggregation, and CAPA has been engaged with the Biden administration since the beginning. We have sent many letters, many recommendations, many correspondence to the administration, making the case that data disaggregation should be central to this administration's mission when it comes to racial equity. We had the honor last summer of sitting across from the president and the vice president in the White House to make this case in terms of what the priorities of the community were, and ultimately, again, data disaggregation and data equity being a cross-cutting issue, that it doesn't matter if you're talking about housing or education or health, this stuff matters. And this is an issue that could fundamentally be a legacy-defining achievement for this administration. And so to be here today, to be able to talk about this issue again with all these experts and with amongst friends is truly an honor. It is also an honor to introduce our next two speakers who will provide opening remarks. And within the universe of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander policy wonks and nerds, which I promise is more than just those of us in the room, these two individuals are names that we should all recognize, because while the work of the Equitable Data Working Group is a reflection of a wide number of government folks, their leadership is really responsible for producing the report that we're going to hear about. So it's my pleasure next to introduce Denise Ross, who is the Chief Data Scientist in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as Margot Schwab, who is the Branch Chief for Statistical and Science Policy at OMB, and a Senior Science Policy Analyst at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. That is a mouthful, but that is a reflection of their expertise and what they bring to the table. So again, Dr. Ross.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Crystal and Erica, for the invitation to be here today. I have to say, I feel very at home with so many mentions of disaggregated data. This is fantastic. 20 years ago, when I started this work democratizing data in New Orleans, we didn't use that term because it was just too wonky. So it's really great to hear it become part of the normal parlance. So anyways, thank you for inviting me. As Greg mentioned, I'm the Chief Data Scientist of the United States. The purpose of my role is to responsibly unlock the power of data to benefit all Americans, with an emphasis on all. I'm excited to be here with you today as we gather to think about how to move our work on equitable data forward, especially with regard to the AA and NHPI community. As you know, equitable data is not a standalone activity. Rather, it describes how the federal government should conduct its business to ensure that everyone in the United States has equitable access to services, programs, and opportunities. The Equitable Data Working Group was tasked with identifying inadequacies in our existing federal data infrastructure and laying out a strategy for improving data practices in the federal government. They released their recommendations on April 22nd. So what's next? Our charge going forward is to operationalize those recommendations in two complementary ways that we can think of as measuring differently and using data differently. So let's break that down. First, we will work together to ensure more equitable measurement of the people of this country. Margot will address OMB's role in that work, setting the standards and ensuring agencies have the resources that they need to invest in this effort. And OSTP and our interagency colleagues in the Equitable Data Working Group will complement that by, one, working to make sure that the people doing the data collection and analysis reflect the experience and perspectives of the communities we're trying to measure. Two, monitoring and reporting back to impacted communities about what progress we're making on creating new norms of disaggregated and equitable data. And three, this is my favorite, using initiatives like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Customer Experience Executive Order as opportunities to institutionalize equitable data collection and assessment. Let's start using these muscles so that it becomes permanent muscle memory. For example, the life experience of recovering from a disaster. How would an equitable data framework ensure that AA and NHPI residents are receiving fair, just, and impartial treatment throughout the process of rebuilding and recovery? So our second big mission is we will work to use data differently. We will not just assess equity, but we will aim to turn those measurements into actions, resulting in durable improvements to government processes and, most importantly, better outcomes for everyone living in the United States. We aim to increase data sharing to enable transparency about the characteristics of those served by social safety net and formula programs. Going back to that example of recovering from a disaster, how can the federal government more equitably provide assistance to AA and NHPI residents whose lives have been upended by hurricane, fire, or flood? The second aim here is to build equitable data strategies and communities of practice around specific domains like health, criminal justice, and the economy by leveraging existing networks tackling these challenges. And thirdly, to shine a light on progress or lack thereof towards serving marginalized populations, including baselines of current conditions. This includes inventorying and publishing existing program data, increasing usability of disaggregated federal statistics, and building community capacity to use such data. So as we look to turn equitable data into equitable outcomes, please let us know about concrete opportunities where disaggregated data on the AA and NHPI community can lead to better design for policies and programs. We can't do our best work in federal government without partners like those of you here today and on the internet. We will report to you on our progress and ask for your help along the way. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it off to Margot.
Okay, so. Okay. You don't need to turn around and look at the slides. I'm putting them up here primarily because there's a link that I want to show you and walk through it quickly. But I am Margot Schwab. It was set up for a short person now. I had the honor to serve as the co-lead for the Equitable Data Working Group. I say that because we met so many interesting and exciting people who really were able to make it real what we were asking for. And as you say, the term disaggregated data can mean all sorts of things, and to really put the people behind it and what we were trying to achieve. And as a social scientist, it was one of my more rewarding experiences here. So I'm going to really just have 3 slides here. You've read the Equitable Data Working Group. I understand you've read our recommendations, and so I don't need to read that to you, and I'm actually very excited to see what your AAPI data response is. So thank you for that. So many of you represent organizations that came in to talk to us. What we learned from the advocates and the agencies in the context of disaggregating under the current minimum OMB categories, what the challenges are, and where you would like to go with having more of that data. One of the things that we heard from you where you want to go with more data, but interestingly, we also heard from several government agencies that they weren't aware that they could actually collect the disaggregated data now. And so one of the things that we are very close to putting out while we gear up to do the official standards is new guidance that encourages disaggregation and specifically shows how it should be done and why it should be done and how you would actually report out based on that. So I'm very excited about that. The next area is requests for funding. So essentially, a lot of folks came to us and said, just change the standard, the OMB standard, and you'll be able to fix everything. And I'm sorry to report that that isn't going to help in and of itself. We need to fund increases in sizes of the statistical surveys. And one of the things that we learned from meeting with the AA and NHPI community was that health and crime victimization, when we asked what are the key things, because there's no way that we can have one funding push and get all surveys increased. So I decided to try and take a more incremental approach. Those of you who know how hard it is to get things through Congress, hopefully you will look at the congressional justification for the National Health Interview Survey. I brought along just the actual wording for you, just this idea that it was specifically opportunities for disaggregation of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, that increase in sample size is there, and we really need you to make sure we get it. Similarly, in the crime victimization space, those of you who know the FBI's National Incident-Based Reporting System, we need to make sure that that is collecting disaggregated data and that we have the data scientists to actually get down deep enough into that to create the disaggregated estimates that we're interested in, as well as increasing sample size for the National Crime Victimization Survey. So these are all in that same bucket. And then finally, one of the things that Denise spoke about was how well are our programs actually meeting the needs of the citizens and all citizens. One of the things that has been really tough is getting race and ethnicity data for program participants. And one of the cool things that we got into the budget was very specifically a matching program so agencies could send their program roles over to Census and have them generate on a routine basis, whether it's every 6 months or whatever. Here are the percentage of people in the different demographic groups. And because Census is the only one who has the disaggregated data for everybody, that's why we went to them. So there's other things in the congressional justifications that we worked really hard to get in. But I'm now going to take to my last slide, which is, so what we learned from meeting with many of you advocates is that you wanted higher visibility of where are the data sets? How do we get access to these data? You like the 2016 report, but it disappeared because it was on the White House website. So let me show you our solution. Now, how do I make this link come up? And we just launched this yesterday in honor of this meeting. So if this is not on a White House site, Landline will make sure that it can be accessed from the site for the initiative, but by housing it on the Federal Committee for Statistical Methodology site, it has a more permanent home. And maybe, could I just drive it? So what you're seeing here is...
Margaret, 1 second, we might need to get amplification for your voice.
Sorry, I thought it would be helpful for you to see, but you will get the website. And what this would, what this allows is, I'm sorry, maybe this isn't, anyway, you can see it, and I will walk you through what's in there. All of the federal statistical data sets that have disaggregated AA and NHPI data are in there. And it shows exactly how you can aggregate how you can get access to them, and as well as some other tools. So we'll be happy to get your feedback on that.
Can we actually get a round of applause for that?
She's taking her time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwab. This is really exciting, a dedicated site for AAPI data. Thank you for sharing that. My name is Janelle Wong, and I am co-director with Karthik Ramakrishnan of AAPI data. And I'm really excited to introduce a panel of federal agency leaders who are working to put many of these principles into practice. And so I'm going to start with a question about the progress that these agencies have made in advancing data equity for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities, and then we will follow up with plans that each agency has for the future. And so let's just get to it. I know everyone's excited to hear from these speakers. Our first speaker is Jordan Masudira, Deputy Undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Education. And again, the question is, share any progress you've made within your agency in advancing data equity for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities.
Thanks, Janelle, and hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here with you all. I want to start by thanking everyone for putting on the event. My colleagues at the mic. I sound very loud to myself. My colleagues at WIOMP and Judy for putting on the event. My federal colleagues in government, especially in the federal statistical agencies, for all the work that they do on this issue, and my academic colleagues, Karthik, Janelle, Julie, for all the research that you do that's uplifted the issue of data disaggregation. Really learned a lot from all of your work, and it's really an honor to be able to work on these issues together with you all. So let me review a few of the different things that the department is working on. So the department is really committed to this issue of data disaggregation, and as part of its agency plan for the year, has really made data disaggregation a priority for promoting equity and ensuring that it's at the foundation of a lot of the work that we do. So forgive a little bit of a lean in my remarks towards focusing on higher education. I'm in the Office of the Undersecretary, where we focus primarily on setting federal financial aid policy and also working with institutions of higher education to really promote student access and student success for all students. And so I'll largely focus some of my remarks in that space. But you'll see from the tool that Margot put together, which some of my colleagues at NCES helped to build, a really beautiful inventory of a lot of the different data sets that the federal government hosts. And from that, you'll see that the department has made some strides towards data disaggregation, but there's really some work that remains to be done. In some of the premier data collection efforts that the department runs that rely on institutional reporting, data disaggregation efforts have lagged behind, in part because it's difficult to move the entire field and all the different institutions that report back up to us. So in data collection efforts like the Common Core of Data, which is a survey of nearly all K-12 schools, in the IPED survey, which is a survey of nearly all institutions that are eligible to receive Title IV, the disaggregation is relatively limited. So we basically have the two Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander categories, but not much disaggregation beyond that. We've made a lot more progress in the longitudinal studies that the department runs. So from the early childhood longitudinal study, the high school longitudinal study, in NPSAS, there's disaggregation of the 6 largest Asian American categories, but still a lot of work to be done in capturing especially disaggregated data for the Southeast Asian community, where we really know a lot of barriers, structural barriers and other factors limit some of their educational success. The same goes for Pacific Islander subgroups, where in the higher we have some disaggregation on the K-12 surveys, but less so on the higher education focused surveys. So one, in terms of the progress that lies ahead, there's some good news to report, and some of it I think is quite exciting. So one kind of bit of news is that we're starting to adopt some of the data disaggregation that we do for Pacific Islander subgroups in the early childhood longitudinal study for the higher education focused longitudinal studies, the NPSAS, and the beginning post-secondary studies surveys, which will help to be able to track student success for those groups. And one of the most, I think, consequential things on the horizon is a change that was facilitated by the passage of the Fafsa Simplification Act in Congress a couple of years ago, which for the first time is going to give the department the capacity to collect data on race and ethnicity through the Fafsa form. And there's statutory language there that suggests that we coordinate with IES. So that suggests kind of mirroring some of the questions that are in NIPSAS already, or NIPSAS, which provides some disaggregation, but not as much as we might like. But then there's language that suggests, to the extent practicable, we try to mirror the questions that are in the ACS, which is really an exciting possibility to be able to drill down to that level. So there are real kind of logistical hurdles between here and there to be able to design a form online that allows for that kind of disaggregation that we can kind of collect in a reasonable sort of way. But that is one of the most exciting opportunities that I think we have going forward. I just want to mention quickly that you'll see shortly in the next few weeks the department going out for notice and comment on some of the questions that are proposed for the coming Fafsa cycle. That is not the Fafsa cycle that's influenced by the Simplification Act. It's a bridge between here and there. But your comments on how we should be collecting that information in that cycle will really be able to will really help us be able to justify making the push towards more disaggregation that we're hoping to get to when we design the Fafsa survey for the following year.
Thank you so much for sharing those developments. Our next speaker is Miranda Lynch Smith, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Policy, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Thank you so much, and I also really appreciate the invitation to speak to you today and for having this amazing summit where we get to talk about data equity and what it really means to us. We affectionately call our office ASPI. ASPI is somewhat of a think tank to the Secretary and to the Department of Health and Human Services. We conduct policy analysis, research and evaluation. We facilitate strategic planning. We are key advisors on poverty and economic analysis, and we lead science and data policy for the department. It's important to state up front, as we're talking about progress, that we recognize that advancing data equity is a comprehensive need that, among other things, requires a foundational action to recognize and build trust in and with the impacted communities so that we're really engaging them. We need to have institutional support within our agency to make improvements and enhancements. And we also need to build the capacity of our own staff to assess the limitations of our existing data holdings and provide the tools internally and externally to uncover the solutions together. Regarding institutional support, we have an Hhs Data Council that guides and informs Health and Human Services data policy in Hhs. That Data Council is engaged in identifying best practices in the collection of disaggregated data so we can be more nuanced in understanding populations. That Data Council also identifies opportunities for the harmonization of data so that we can do a better job of understanding impacts across programs for populations, and coordinating Hhs collaboration with private sector entities, state and local governments, and other partners about using data. One particular project I wanted to mention at the Data Council, we're doing an inventory and review of our programmatic administrative data sets for the extent to which they are collecting disaggregated data by race and ethnicity now, with the goal of identifying challenges, addressing those challenges, identifying policies and programmatic changes across Hhs to improve the data that we're collecting, including for AA and NHPI populations. To the point of capacity and solution-focused tools, we have an internal technical assistance center that provides training tools and technical assistance to our Hhs components to conduct equity assessments and build capacity for making our policies, programs, research, and data analysis more equitable, including by addressing better disaggregating data. And then a foundational activity we engage in is to promote the use of cultural and linguistic standards or class standards in healthcare, in addition to increasing our efforts to better translate materials, guidance, and instructions to the many different Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities. For example, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is implementing a new segment of required cultural competency training for marketplace agents and brokers that are participating in the marketplace in 2023. That training provides information on how to follow cultural and linguistically appropriate service standards to provide effective assistance, communicate effectively with consumers, recognize cultural implications of language, and more. And we really believe that through that better engagement of AA and NHPI communities, we can both improve services for individuals and communities and improve HHS's ability to collect valid data from and with individuals in these population groups. I do want to mention a couple of really concrete things that are specific to the AA and NHPI populations. We are a huge department. We are really engaged in quite a lot. The Affordable Care Act includes several provisions aimed at eliminating health disparities, including a provision for data standardization, and that's where we first took we really took, I think, from what you said, Dr. Schwab, in terms of permission to go beyond what the OMB standards were and have much more data disaggregation within the AA and NHPI communities. We have 11 categories that we're tracking there. The National Center for Health Statistics will release a public-facing interactive data query tool with 3-year national health interview survey estimates for NHPI and select Asian American subpopulations. And that will be released this fall in 2020 and address many health outcomes. Just one more I'll mention is with the Administration for Children and Families. They're leading efforts to better visualize where AA and NHPI communities are impacted by child maltreatment or otherwise involved with child welfare programs. And we're displaying interactive maps that allow people to see and explore the geographic variation by race and ethnicity. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to hear about new data visualization tools on the site. Our next speaker is Nicholas Jones, and actually Nicholas Jones and Rachel Marks will be presenting together. Nicholas Jones is the Director and Senior Advisor of Race and Ethnic Research and Outreach in the Population Division of the U.S. Census Bureau, and Rachel Marks is the Chief of the Racial Statistics Branch, Population Division at the U.S. Census Bureau.
Thank you, Janelle, and thank you to Crystal and Erica for inviting us today and having this important summit. Rachel and I are very pleased to take part in this important panel discussion with perspectives from the U.S. Census Bureau about the importance of data disaggregation. The research and experience of our Census Bureau team and our colleagues has helped create a really strong framework for data disaggregation about our nation's racial and ethnic communities, particularly our diverse Asian and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, and all communities across the country. We know how critical these data are. We've heard that from our community partners, we've heard that from our research colleagues, and we know that we have a huge responsibility at the Census Bureau to produce these statistics. So we're here today to talk with you about our initiatives to produce the 2020 census data products that will yield important insights for particular detail groups that are not collected and tabulated in other federal surveys, and also how you can be part of these important efforts.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting us here today. So we've deeply benefited from our discussions and engagements with Asian and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander researchers and community leaders over the past several years. They've helped us get to where we are today. Prior to the 2020 census, we conducted extensive research and consulted with experts, scholars, and organizational leaders to improve our census code list. This slide here provides an excerpt of our 2020 census code list, which you can access on census.gov in our technical documentation. For 2020, we've added several new detailed Asian groups, including several Central Asian groups, as well as Sikh and Sindhi, and several groups in our other Asian category, like Malay and Urdu. The addition of these detailed Asian groups gives us the ability to collect, code, and tabulate data for detailed Asian populations, as we've done in the decennial census for several decades.
Now, in the same way for the Pacific Islander community, prior to 2020 census, we conducted extensive research and consulted with NHPI experts on how we could improve and build our code list. For the 2020 census, we added several new detailed Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander groups, including Maori, Ratuman, Narawan, and also New Caledonian. The addition of these detailed Pacific Islander codes gives us the ability to collect, code, classify, and tabulate data for communities across the Pacific Islander community in the United States, with even more detailed data than we produced in 2010.
Our proposal for producing 2020 Census detailed race and ethnicity group population counts and characteristics data focuses on tables that have been developed in an attempt to balance confidentiality requirements and the programmatic, legal, and statistical needs of our data users and stakeholders. External partner feedback combined with the Census Bureau's review of table access rates and our subject matter expert knowledge informed the development of our 2020 Census data products. We're planning to produce data for more detailed race and ethnicity groups than we ever have before, but at many fewer geographic levels and also for fewer and less detailed tables to balance accuracy and privacy. The Detailed Demographic and Housing Characteristics File A, also known as the Detailed DHCA, is the product where you'll be able to get data on detailed Asian groups like Chinese, Thai, and Asian Indian, and also detailed Pacific Islander groups like Native Hawaiian, Fijian, and Marshallese. Our highest priority is to provide the most accurate data possible for the critical statistics needed for these detailed population groups. We're also planning to provide statistics on detailed sex by age for selected groups in this product. Not all groups will receive data on sex by age. This will be determined based on the population size of that group in each geographic area. Some data users have asked us to include data for lower levels of geography, like places such as cities and towns, and also census tracts. So we're taking that feedback into consideration, and we're now testing the feasibility of adding those levels of geography to this product, to the already included levels of geography, which are nation, states, counties, and American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian areas. Through our ongoing engagement with the public and the use cases that many data users, including many of you here today, have submitted to us, we've been able to learn more about the critical data needs that these data are for. This feedback has led us to the decision to prioritize the production of these statistics over other statistics in the detailed DHC product. And the detailed DHCA is scheduled for release in August 2023.
We've deeply benefited from engaging with Asian and Pacific Islander organizations and across the country over the years, particularly many of the organizations that are here today and with us online. We know that WIAPI has helped to champion these efforts along with NCAPA and also AAPI data, and we appreciate their support as we continue to move forward. Our research and testing will involve a dialogue with communities and partners like all of you. We need your feedback. It's a critical part of this crucial process for producing these data. In January of 2023, we'll produce a prototype data product for the public to review and to help us as a proof of concept show that we can produce accurate and reliable data that also meets confidentiality standards. We're going to fine-tune parameters and plans for the detailed DHCA product, but it's going to be important to have your feedback in that effort. So before we move into the production phase of this, we'll have additional engagements with stakeholders and partners, and we encourage you to be involved. We look forward to championing these future discussions with you to help leaders and researchers in the AA and NHPI community help with the development of the detailed DHC data product as we work to produce these critical 2020 census statistics. So thank you for your efforts, and we look forward to the discussions.
And our next speaker is Dory Allard, Assistant Commissioner for Industry Employment Statistics at the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Thank you so much. I am so very, very honored to be here, and thank everybody for participating in this event. Oh, I went backwards, didn't I? No, I didn't. Okay. All right. So at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, our largest household survey is also our most prominent one, and it's where we have focused most of our data disaggregation efforts. I'm talking about the Current Population Survey, or the CPS, which is a monthly survey of about 60,000 households. It's the source of the national unemployment rate and many other labor market measures. Data from this survey are some of the earliest labor market measures available each month, and they tend to be widely reported by the press on the first Friday of the month. BLS began its efforts on data disaggregation in about 2010, when it began evaluating data on the 7 Asian groups we collect in the CPS. The CPS is a considerably smaller survey than many of the other surveys that are at the Census Bureau, for example. And so we weren't sure that the sample sizes for these groups would support robust estimates. Over the course of the next few years, though, we managed to really increase the accessibility and the publication that we did of these data. We started by producing a report that pooled together 3 years of data and presented details on these 7 Asian groups. And then we expanded that by going to publishing annually in our race and ethnicity report that shows the characteristics, the labor market characteristics of folks. And then we also put things in these series in our online database, and we made sure that the information was also available in our public use files so that researchers who are doing their own analyses can use these data. And then I wanted to talk about what we're doing now. The easiest way, though, to talk about what we're doing now is to show a picture. And so this is the employment population ratio, which is one of those metrics that we publish every month, the first Friday of every month, to gauge the health of the labor market. And the blue line shows the average for the nation overall, and you can certainly see when the pandemic began to affect the labor market. Between February 2020 and April 2020, there was a decline in this metric of almost 10 percentage points, and we'd never seen anything like that. It's a really unprecedented decline. The metric has since recovered quite a bit, but it is still not back in April of 2022 to the level it was in February of 2020. The green line shows Asians overall, and you can see that it's a bit higher than the overall metric. That's because Asians are a bit more likely to be employed than the population overall. As the pandemic started, they had a similar drop in their employment population ratio, but they've recovered a bit faster. In April of 2022, that metric was almost back to where it was in February of 2020. Now let's look at Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. A bit less illuminating. They have, we only have annual averages for these data. That is, we take 12 months of data and average them together so that we have one data point for the year. You can see some interesting things from these data. For example, Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders are more likely to be employed than the population overall and than Asians, but you cannot see how the pandemic unfolded for these groups. So that's what we're doing at BLS right now. We are looking at these data, we are evaluating them, and we are hoping to publish them monthly. Once we're done with that, we will look at the data for the 7 Asian groups that we publish. Again, this chart shows that it's very clear that these groups are experiencing the labor market in different ways, but we cannot see how the pandemic affects these labor market developments. Once if we are able to produce monthly data, we will have much better data to evaluate going forward. So thank you very much. Our website is here, and you can contact us this way.
Thank you so much. Love the BLS. Our next set of speakers are George Carter and Lydia Taghavi. George is the Director of Housing and Demographic Analysis George Carter is the Director of Housing and Demographic Analysis Division, Office of Policy Development and Research, and Lydia Taghavi is the Acting Chief Data Officer, Office of Policy Development and Research, and they are both at the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
I am worried about this. Let's see. Okay, it looks like I have so many slides, but I can compact it in a few minutes. So let's go through it. HUD, if you look at the inventory of automated systems in HUD, you would see that there are about 200 programs. But these 200 programs can be grouped in 4 different buckets. One is the role of HUD in the mortgage market, which is ensuring mortgages for single-family and multifamily dwellings and extension of loans for home improvement. The second one is the role of HUD in low-income rental housing programs, and there are 4 of them: public housing, vouchers, privately owned assisted projects, which is sometimes called multifamily housing, and then the low-income housing tax credit. Actually, low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, is not a HUD program, it's a Treasury program, but we were mandated to collect the data for them, so we do. For public housing, we provide operating fund and capital fund for certain local public housing agencies. And we do collect data on families. The families pays 30% of income in general. Privately owned assisted projects. These are multifamily housing. We provide, these are privately owned apartments or units, at least 5 units in each building. So the tenants pay about 30% of income for rent. There's about 1.6 million units. The voucher program is, the family qualifies to the program through calibration of income, but they can choose their own units in the general marketplace. And HUD calibrates these units whether it qualifies according to some safety standards. Then, as I said, the low-income housing tax credit is we only collect the data and Treasury runs the program. But the next bucket of what we have is the role of HUD in community development. So we have a program office called Community Planning and Development. This office provide grants to states, municipalities, and cities, and other entities. Then the other big role of HUD in housing is fair housing. So we are we enforce the law of fair housing, which means we cannot use race and color and ethnicity and religion or presence of children or disability for providing assistance to the public. So, but where does, most of these are income-based. We are not, we are collecting data on race and ethnicity as a nice to have. So where do we go from here? That means our data on race and ethnicity is kind of limited. Maybe you may question the data quality of these things, but still, we can use the data in many ways. It can tell the story of where the people are, how much they are receiving from HUD, how much the income they have. I would like to, I have a little chart here that gives us the volume of people in the rental housing program, or the families, because the subsidies are given to families, not persons. So as of December 31st of 2021, the rental housing program has a volume of 4.5 million families. About 3.6% are Asians. A little less than 1% are Pacific Islander. So the volume is small, but what else do they get? There's a lot of stories that we can tell about them, how much rent they are paying, how much HUD is giving them as a subsidy. But we don't know how much impact those things have. I can tell you where they are, I can tell you how much they are receiving from HUD, but I don't know what the impact of that is. Meaning, for example, if I am in the program and I receive $600 per month from HUD as a subsidy for rent, HUD doesn't know whether I use the $600 to buy additional healthcare or additional education. So this is where I would like to go back to what Ms. Ross said, measuring and reusing the data. So this is where we are in HUD. And the other portion of it will be for
I will very quickly go through my slides. Sorry. Thank you. So administrative data sources and survey data sources have strengths and weaknesses. Lydia has discussed the strengths of the administrative data HUD collects and how it can be used for policy research and how to monitor programs. HUD's administrative data collects only limited demographic data and lacks detailed data on housing characteristics and quality. Survey data has its own strengths and weaknesses, and unlike administrative data, which is collected as a byproduct of program administration, surveys rely on respondent knowledge and interpretation as part of the process of data collection. For this reason, surveys may under or over-report program participation depending on respondents' knowledge of their own program participation and their interpretation of survey questions. Surveys are also subject to sampling error, which places limitations on the level of geography for which reliable estimates can be produced. The largest survey that we have in the United States that collects housing characteristics and costs is the American Community Survey. It has collected AA and NHPI data since 2008 and can be used to produce granular geography. The American Housing Survey that's sponsored by HUD collects detailed housing characteristics, housing costs, and housing quality, has self-reported housing subsidy status, which has the potential problems that I mentioned before, and has collected AA and NHPI data since 2015. It has less granular geography because it has a smaller sample size. So for both of these surveys, we have matched our HUD administrative data on subsidy status to these surveys. For the American Community Survey, we're able to, with this matched data, analyze housing costs and limited housing characteristics. And with the AHS, we're able to perhaps group AA and NHPI categories to produce special tabulations with those data. Thank you. And both Sean Buckholz, who was my predecessor, served on a committee developing the methodologies for collecting these data, and Emily Molfino on my staff is working with the ICSP on the disaggregation of the data going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we've seen a little bit about where these agencies have been, and now let's talk for just, if you can each spend maybe 2 minutes about, or less, let's talk about where you are going and what you would like to see in the future in terms of exploring ideas to advance data equity for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and how you might involve community organizations as partners in that work. And we'll just go quickly down the line. I'm going to start again with Jordan Masudira.
Lightning round. Okay, just as an aside, I know we're out of time, but I can't believe as a academic who's been away from a university for a year that I missed the opportunity to put together a PowerPoint and talk at people from behind a lectern. That said, so some of the things that we're working on, I want to come back and just underscore the point that I left on last time about the ability to collect new data on the Fafsa, because it really opens up a lot of opportunities for us going forward. So that in what I think Janelle had said earlier about kind of going for, or maybe it was Margot, going from equitable measurement to equitable outcomes is really the crux of what I want to just hit on briefly. So we're really trying to get better data on better disaggregated data, like across all college students who are federally aided, which is about 15 million students who receive aid to go to college every year. So this is really a vast data set covering a really large swath. of everybody who interacts with colleges and universities in the U.S. And has a lot of information both on how they experience college, but also on their outcomes in terms of successful loan repayment, earnings outcomes, and so on, that we're able to measure through this data infrastructure. So in terms of community engagement, really getting that feedback from you about how useful that kind of data would be is very important. And then the next step in that process for us, which we've begun, is starting to work with institutions to help work with them around best practices to really promote closing achievement gaps, graduation gaps, gaps and other kinds of outcomes across the students that they serve. Of course, having good data is a very important part of that to be able to see the equity gaps that need to be addressed, but also having a sense for all of the different factors that really mediate student success while they're in college, so that we can help put together, especially for under-resourced institutions, visualizations that help college leaders really focus on what the problems are and what the most promising interventions might be to tackle the problems that are preventing students from being successful in underserved communities. So that was quick, but let me leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I see some community partners nodding vigorously, excited about these potential developments. And next, Miranda Lynch-Smith from the Department of Health and Human Services.
Right. I think we might be echoing some of the very same things. So we see lots of opportunity and future work and partnership. We appreciate a summit like this because it really gets a conversation started about how we arrive at a clear research agenda together. What do we actually want to do with our disaggregated data? What are the questions we're looking to answer about structural barriers, about well-being, environmental impacts, health of AA and NHPI populations and the services provided to them? And we're particularly focused on what are the relevant questions that are of importance to the impacted communities themselves. So for example, we have an NIH project, all of us, research program, right? We're currently collecting disaggregated data on 18 AA and NHPI populations. We're gonna have a very large, 1 million people health database, and that will allow us to learn about biology, lifestyle, environmental effect health, how the environmental aspects affect health. So what do we want to get from that together? We know also that just collecting additional data is not without costs. We want to get more granular, not in just what we're collecting, but how we're collecting it, how we're balancing things like financial investments and administrative burden, but also the psychological costs of collecting additional data, particularly when we know that we are sometimes dealing with under-resourced communities. We want to be really careful about what is the case for using data, and is that outweighing the aspects of not collecting that data. And we want to do better in really best utilizing the data that we have. So how do we better link our administrative data sets, not just the HHS holdings, but ones across the federal government? We all talk about social determinants of health, and we know that there's lots of interrelationships. So we want to get more practice in how we are linking data sets together to answer key questions. So we really think there's opportunity to engage communities meaningfully in that exercise in every part of the process.
Thank you so much. And next, let's hear from the Census.
Hi again, everyone. So one thing that we are really looking forward to that Nicholas mentioned at the end of our presentation is this, what we're calling a proof of concept product for our detailed DHCA. So what's really been important as we developed our detailed DHCA product, where we'll produce data for detailed Asian and Pacific Islander groups, is the community feedback. It's really gotten us to where we are today. It's gotten us to start looking at adding additional geographies. It's gotten us to the point where we're able to prioritize the production of the total pop counts and the sex and age statistics. Your feedback has been critical for us to learn what statistics are most important and share how you're using these data. So when we talk about a proof of concept product, we're going to be putting this out to really illustrate what this data product is going to look like. Because if you're not familiar, we're using something called differential privacy in our 2020 data products to protect respondents' confidentiality. So this means that the data is, it's going to have a little bit of noise infused to protect people. So we want to show you how this works and how the data will look, how much error will be in it, and how it will operate. And it will be really important for us to get your feedback and work with you so that you can understand that data and make sure it's meeting your uses and that you'll be able to use those data.
Thank you so much. And next from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
I think, okay. So I'll echo some of those same things that the Census Bureau shared. It's just really, really important for, I think, any statistical agency to hear from our users how the data are being used and what is the, what are the critical needs. And without that, we really can't progress and can't serve the people the way that we want to. We've heard from communities that they really want more timely data, so that is where we are trying to concentrate our efforts at the moment. But really, any kind of feedback that we get from you all is terrifically helpful for all of us. Thank you.
And let's next hear from the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Hi. At the end of what I was saying about the American Community Survey and the American Housing Survey, I was talking both about data sets where we had matched HUD administrative data on HUD subsidy status to our household level surveys. So in making these matches, there are challenges in what we can release and what the data can tell us. So for the American Housing Survey, we can produce estimates of housing characteristics, housing costs, and housing quality. But in our match to the subsidized data, our cell sizes are too small to produce the breakout among the different AA and NHPI groups. With the ACS, that's more possible, but there's less housing data on the ACS.
Thank you. And Nicholas, let's hear back from the census. I saw that you had a few more words to say.
Thanks, Janelle. I just had one more thing to add, and that's really about the responsibility that the census has with the decennial data products to produce data that's not available anywhere other than that decennial infrastructure. And so as part of that, we really take the pride in analyzing the data and telling the stories about what it impacts us in terms of understanding how we're growing, how we're changing, and where opportunities are to better measure equity. So that's one thing that you can count on from us with the delivery of that data set next year. Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you. And I want to thank our panelists. I also just want us to reflect for a moment. This is a chance to really think about where we're going into the future. And if we meet again next year, where will we be on these aspirational goals for data equity for Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities? We really want this to be the beginning of that conversation. Thank you again to our panelists. And we will reconvene at 2:30 for the second community organization panel. Thank you again.
Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for sticking with us. If you're still on the internet, I will assume that data equity and data disaggregation gives you life, like me. But it is certainly my pleasure to introduce our next panel, which are colleagues, friends, and people I have a deep amount of respect for, members of NCAPA, who are doing this work every day when we're talking about data equity. I'll briefly introduce everybody, but I will recognize that obviously the last panel gave us a lot to think about. We certainly like it when federal agencies give us more information to work with. It keeps us busy, so thank you. I will also recognize that due to COVID restrictions, we weren't able to accommodate every member of NCAPA here today, but many of whom aren't here deserve a ton of recognition because they are also doing the work. APCHO, Capacity, ARIA, the Asian Real Estate Association of America, South Asian Americans Leading Together, the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement, and Advancing Justice, AAJC, are instrumental in the recommendations that were referenced earlier that we submitted to the Biden administration. So hopefully they're watching, and thank you to all of them for their work. So let's get into it. Again, these are my friends, so this should be easy, right? Let's start with asking all of you again to introduce yourself, introduce your organization, and sort of how you arrive here at data equity work or data disaggregation work. So let's start with Sina Wipi, who is a policy associate at Empowering Pacific Islander Communities.
Thank you so much, Greg. Hello, everyone. Maloa Lele. My name is Sina Wipi. I'm the policy associate for EPIC, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. We are a national organization based on Tongva land in Los Angeles, California. And I just want to acknowledge the land that we are currently on, which is Anacostan land. How EPIC came to be, especially in the data equity space, is essentially, data equity is a part of our organizational DNA. EPIC founders were called on by elders and necessitated to counter narratives that weaponize data to call our communities statistically insignificant and inherently unhealthy. There was a need to ensure that disaggregated data was more closely represented of the lived realities of our communities. EPIC believes data is a tool for measuring systemic distance from equity, not just from quantifying suffering. I just want to show a slide. So if you look at this map behind me, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander is a geopolitical identity and recognizing the indigeneity of Native Hawaiians and those who hail from the territories. If you can see that the display shows that the different pathways of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and their migration to the United States. The different categories are broken down to those who are born as U.S. citizens, U.S. nationals in American Samoa. Only U.S. soil you can be born on and not be a U.S. citizen. COFA, which are the island nations of Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. And the compacts are currently, under negotiations. Many things promised in the original compacts that were stripped in the late 1990s under welfare reform. Many thanks. And I want to acknowledge the work that Senator Hirono and the bill that she worked on to restore COFA Medicaid in December of 2020, which took a decades-long fight to restore Medicaid for COFA communities, and there was definitely work from the community side and a lot of work done by COFA leaders such as the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese. We also have those with no formal relationship with the U.S., which tend to have larger undocumented populations and statuses that only exist for the Pacific.
Thank you, Sina. Let's go next to Kam Mua, who is the Director of National Policy at the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center.
Good afternoon, Nyajong. My name is Kam. I work at the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, also known as CRAC. Our organization was founded in 1979 to help resettle Southeast Asian refugees who who came to the U.S. and were resettled after the Vietnam War, the Secret War in Laos, and the Khmer Rouge genocide. Since then, our organization serves as a civil rights organization championing the education, health, and immigration rights of these populations. Data disaggregation is one of the most fundamental issues that we work on, specifically because our communities have continuously been invisible from a data perspective for over 3 decades. Our organization has been working on this issue for as long as I've known the organization, so my entire lifetime. And the reason for this is that we believe that our populations, that Southeast Asian refugees have a fundamentally different experience than the rest of the Asian American population in the US. As individuals who are resettled in the US because of forced displacement by war and by genocide and political persecution, they carry with them the emotional traumas that have colored their everyday lived experiences. And that also is seen in the way that they've been unable to access public benefits or basic rights. So for example, in 2006, when NIH released their reports on diabetes regarding Southeast Asian Americans, a big chunk of the report had to do with mental health and trauma in Southeast Asian American communities, specifically how the trauma that these individuals are carrying with them prevent them from being able to access basic health care. And for us, that information is seen across all data sets. When we look at how Southeast Asian Americans have some of the lowest socioeconomic status amongst all Asian population, it is because of the fact that they have a fundamentally different experience, that they came to the US with no money, with no language skills, some of them with only one parent, and with less family members than other Asian Americans and other immigrant communities. So when we look at data at CRAC, our focus is not just about ensuring that we have data around Cambodian, Hmong, Laotian, and Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian American communities, but is to recognize the sacrifices that these populations have made to our countries when they have sacrificed their families, their countries, and crossed rivers and crossed oceans to come to the US, and that they deserve the same access to public benefits and programs as well, but are unable to do so because we don't have accurate information about these populations because their population groups, their population data is oftentimes not big enough. In the aggregate, Southeast Asian populations, aside from Vietnamese, only make up around 700,000 individuals. However, that shouldn't be that isn't a sufficient enough reason for us not to have a vested interest in tracking the ways that refugee populations that we are directly responsible for have changed and acclimated in the US or have not been able to acclimate since they've been resettled. I'll stop there. At CRAC, our reports also are inherently disaggregated because of the fact that we focus specifically on these populations. We have a recent report from 2020 around higher education, and the barriers that our populations face. And we also have a 2020 report detailing the demographic data of our populations as well.
Thank you, Kham. Next, I'd like to recognize Rina Kitazawa-Griffin, who is a VP and Chief of Staff at the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum.
Thank you, Greg. Hi, everyone. My name is Rina Kitazawa-Griffin, and I am the Vice President and Chief of Staff of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and we really appreciate being a part of this conversation. Just to tell you a little bit about our organization, the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum, which I'll refer to as the Health Forum, is the nation's oldest and leading health advocacy organization working to improve access to care and quality of care for the AA and NHPI communities. Advancing health equity through data equity is at the core of what we do. COVID-19 has highlighted some of the pressing issues of the communities we serve and underscored the importance of getting good data to capture the needs of the AA and NHPI communities. For example, the dual pandemic effect of COVID-19 that made it challenging to get the community vaccinated. Specifically, through our CDC work, we received numerous reports from our partners community partners serving Asian Americans who are unwilling to leave their homes to get vaccinated because of the rise in anti-Asian hate. In addition, we also heard stories of shot administration sites telling Asian American recipients that they don't deserve the vaccine. Language access continues to be an issue for the AA and NHPI communities, given the diversity of the communities we serve and the lack of resources. While the Health Forum has translated its materials in over 30 languages, it's still not enough. The lack of culturally appropriate and linguistically tailored materials, language access is one of the greatest barriers for getting accurate data for our communities. Today, I'd like to highlight some of our recent work in urging policymakers as well as community leaders on data disaggregation efforts. Through our collaboration with 4 advocacy organizations, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, the National Congress of American Indians, the National Urban League, and UNIDOS US, we reviewed the landscape of data disaggregation in different states to get a better understanding of the barriers, challenges, and opportunities for improving the collection, analysis, and reporting of disaggregated data. What we found is that many state health surveys, programs, tools, and data collection instruments do not consistently capture even the bare minimum categories set by the Office of Management and Budget. States are also in different stages of readiness in terms of their progress on passing policies, legislation that support disaggregated data. Although we have some states like California, which are called early adopters, having passed legislation that requires state agencies to collect data on more than 20 AA and NHPI groups. States have to understand their own demographics and expand data collection to include specific communities within larger populations. And of course, community leaders continue to play an important role in communicating the importance of collecting, analyzing, and reporting data on specific communities. I'd just like to conclude by stating that we know that comprehensive data by racial and ethnic subgroups must be openly and transparently reported, collected, and analyzed to fully understand and address the needs of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena. And next, I'd like to recognize Julia Ajenka, who's the Senior Vice President at APIA Scholars.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to everyone for inviting us to have this important conversation. Like Greg mentioned, I'm Julia Ajenka with APIA Scholars, where I serve as Senior Vice President. And for those of you who aren't familiar with APIA Scholars, we're the nation's largest scholarship provider for AA and NHPI students who are underserved across higher education. And we were founded nearly 20 years ago, next year we turn 20, really to dispel this myth that we are a monolith of a community and we have no barriers or financial needs to go to college. And so over the past 20 years, we have really evolved to understanding that financial affordability is a piece of the puzzle, but in addition to scholarships, students need wraparound supports, career mentoring, advising, and so we're really thinking about how students succeed at the holistic level. So, what I wanted to share today was a little bit, first off, I think it's fantastic from the previous panel to hear allies in the Department of Education, like Jordan, identifying the mechanisms that we actually can improve upon data collection. And so last fall, CRAC and APIA Scholars partnered to actually identify what the subgroup classifications should be in FAFSA, and we were thrilled that 55 community organizations, many in this room, signed on to support it. And we know that in the next coming weeks, higher ed organizations are also coming together to identify the Fafsa Simplification Act as an important opportunity to collect fine-grained data. But also, we know that educational attainment data income inequality data. This is all incredibly important to understand at the disaggregated level for everything that my co-panelists have identified. And so if you look at these screens, these should look pretty familiar to anyone in this room, right? When you start disaggregating according to our subgroups, you see incredible disparities. But what I'd also like to highlight, and what we're working on at APIA Scholars, is collecting new data to really know more about our student experiences throughout the pipeline of education. So this year, we're proud to have launched our first applicant survey, where we asked students about their experiences leading up to college, through college, and after college. And we're really excited to finally share these results in a forthcoming report, the State of AA and NHPI Students in Higher Education, this September. But some early results are really fascinating. Asking students about their experiences with mental health supports and anti-Asian hate during the pandemic, certainly we're seeing those as pressing needs that institutions need to meet. But in addition to those issues, we are also seeing nearly half of our students are reporting as English language learners. So that really identifies the importance of this type of programming at colleges and universities. And then 1 in 5 of our applicants identify as members of the LGBTQ community, which has really gone, sort of unspoken about and under-addressed from a student perspective in higher education for our communities. So we're really excited to be shining the spotlight on new types of data so that we're not just looking at persistence and completion without understanding what leads to completion. And then the last thing I want to mention is that we're also really digging in deep to identifying the experiences of NHPI students in particular. Now, this is the only student population that is experiencing a 30% decrease in intergenerational mobility. So the reason we care about higher education and see it as an avenue of opportunity, this community is not experiencing it. And so as I wrap up, I just want to mention a really fascinating research partnership we have with our friends at UCLA and at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who has been collaborating to actually identify how NHPI students have been severely undercounted by the regulations that institutions have to report data to iPads through. And so you'll see that in Las Vegas, they knew that their NHPI population was growing incredibly over the last decade, yet enrollment statistics showed that the NHPI students were decreasing. And so they used a culture of inquiry to really dig into their data. And what they saw was the way that students are aggregated to 2 or more races really impacts NHPI students, because nearly half of these students identify as 2 or more races. And so you actually see iPads only capturing 200 some odd NHPI students, and 1,600 went unreported, right? So we really want to shine a spotlight on how we can be smarter at the institutional level and lift up some examples so that we don't invisibilize any of our students. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to reintroduce my friend Karthik Ramakrishnan, founder and co-director at API Data.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful engagement here. I love that bonus present we got from the Office of Management and Budget in terms of having a data portal with links to statistical data sets that disaggregate our community. Greg, before you were at NCAPA, one of our first collaborations with NCAPA was to create a data repository that was tagged with the different communities that one can find with the microdata. Of course, the Census Bureau and its microdata, they got everything all the time with the American Community Survey and the Current Population Survey. We look forward to digging deeper into this resource and are just so grateful for the partnership and the inspiration from allies in federal agencies. Our work at API Data, on the one hand, you can think of us as the title suggests, as a producer of original data, as well as research that builds upon data sets produced by federal agencies, state agencies, and other institutions. But data is one part of what we do. I had mentioned briefly this framework that we employ. It's something that was generated from another thing that I founded called the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside. And that's that framework that's simply called DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. And we believe that all three of these are important no matter the kind of organization you're talking about, including research organizations. And a lot of those insights have been built over the years being in partnership with community organizations. API data got started in 2013. Our first major report, the state of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States, came out in 2014. But I remember one of our funders, the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation, Sue Van, specifically pulled me aside and said, your research is only as good as the community partnerships you have. And that's been ingrained in our work since the beginning. And what you're seeing today is the fruits of a lot of those partnerships. In addition to community partnerships, we've been very honored to be working with the White House Initiative, even the White House Initiative on APIs under the Obama administration, now the White House Initiative on Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders under the Biden administration. And to see this kind of work come forth, there is no way that any one of us does this alone, and so we're just really grateful for our partnership with various entities. In terms of reports that we've put out recently, in addition to the data equity report that we did in partnership with NCAPA that was released yesterday, we have a national report on key demographic patterns and trends involving AA and NHPI communities that will be released this week. And even as we are so familiar with so much of what's going on in our communities, sometimes when you take a look at the data again, there are surprising findings. So for example, when you think about nativity in the Asian American community, we've traditionally known that Japanese Americans are more native born than foreign born. By the way, Asian Americans are the only racial group that is a majority foreign born, and it's predominantly foreign born. But when we looked at the latest ACS data, we saw that the Hmong American population is even more native born than the Japanese American population. Seeing data like that and to really think through the deeper meanings there and what we need to do in terms of refreshing our understanding of these communities is so important. It's important when you look at immigration and migration patterns in both Pacific Islander as well as Asian American communities, but also those longer settled and native-born populations. What does intergenerational progress look like? These are some of the questions that we dive into when we look at data. And I'll say, in addition to Janelle Wong, who you heard from, Ryan Vinn, our data and community partnership specialist, has been essential in the work that we do. Howard Shee, our managing director, who's a lead author on our data equity report, and Nahanda Tangsala from NCAPA, who's our API data fellow. We have many other senior researchers, including Jennifer Lee, Nines Ponce, and Sarah Sadwani, who many of you know from the incredible work that they do. We're just so grateful to be in partnership with all of you in this work of data, narrative, and action.
Thank you, Karthik. So I have a few follow-up questions for you all. Starting with you, Sina. We know at the early days of the pandemic, we were not necessarily prepared, right? Many of us weren't quite sure what was going on, but the Asian American Pacific Islander community certainly heard the stories, the narratives in the early days of people being afraid to visit our restaurants. We felt that impact far sooner than many. But one untold story that is starting to get more and more attention is the lack of data infrastructure around health equity that existed for our communities. And we all understand, we know the talking points that when we ignore health inequities, those longstanding practices and barriers to access start to have real consequential, there seems to be real problems when you run into that over the long term. And so knowing Epic and knowing the work that they did, in the early days of the pandemic, they put in a lot of work to stand up data infrastructure for their communities as it relates to the impact that COVID-19 was having on them. So Sina, tell us more about that, tell us about that work, and tell us really how you shone light on your own community about what they were really experiencing there.
Thanks, Greg. So for the past 2 years, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have had the highest COVID rates in several states. And right now, NHPIs have the highest death and contraction rates in 10 of the 20 states that do disaggregate data. If you look at the slide behind me, the gray states represent states that don't disaggregate data. And the lack of disaggregation is particularly troubling in places like Texas and Nevada that have large concentrations of NHPIs and some of the fastest growing NHPI populations. Another slide. And the next slide is really the lessons that reveal the lessons that we've learned from California in particular, that disaggregation demonstrates extreme disparities. Some of the lessons from community advocates from the Southern California Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team fought against data suppression because thresholds disadvantage smaller populations. Lessons on how to deal with majority mixed populations like NHPIs. Filipinos were miscategorized as Pacific Islander, and the Riverside County Public Health was showing over 100% vaccination, and the Inland Empire Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team was helping to validate and correct that data. Learning from the best practices of AI and AN communities who have similar trajectories and relationships to the U.S.
Thank you, Sina. Rena, from the health forum's perspective, I mean, you all really took up the charge of helping our community across the board respond to the pandemic. I know that you worked very closely with the Department of HHS and making sure funds were being driven to our communities to create resources and information to best respond to the pandemic. Tell us more about some of that work and sort of help us understand and help our viewers understand just how critical that work was in the early days of the pandemic.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about our experience with the pandemic. Since the start of the pandemic in March of 2020, we found that the experience of the AA and NHPI communities have been largely overlooked due to inconsistent reporting. And one of the challenges that we have found is that Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are categorized as two distinct and different racial groups. However, when it comes to funding, like COVID education, outreach, and vaccination fundings, they're often treated as one. And this monolithic approach has created disparities, particularly in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, who have had a disproportionately high rate of COVID-19 related deaths. And it's not just COVID-19 infection and vaccination rates of the AA and NHPI communities that have not been consistently collected or disaggregated, but other pandemic-related health data points that are not well known. For example, changes in healthcare coverage during the pandemic, mental health illnesses or other ailments that went unaddressed because of the pandemic, and the number of people using telehealth, and those who have medical debt. Just to highlight one of the things that the Health Forum did in January of 2022 is that we worked with 10 community partners to release a rapid needs assessment survey as part of a CDC-funded COVID-19 initiative called Forging Partnerships. And the purpose of the survey was really to understand the COVID-19 needs and knowledge of Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. The survey was made available online and translated into different Asian languages, and we received over 1,300 responses. And the data is currently being analyzed and will be used to inform COVID-19 resources and materials to support the AA and NHPI communities. And we also plan to issue a disaggregated report by AA and NHPI subgroups.
Thanks, Rena. Julie, you had a great presentation with a lot of data. I was trying my best to keep up. I think there was a lot of good information there that I actually I'd ask you to revisit, right? Those are some of the points we've been trying to make for a very, very long time with government officials. And I know, or it certainly sounds like you've had robust engagement with the Department of Education, which is a breath of fresh air. I know that to be true. But let's go back to some of that data you shared. What does data equity look like in higher ed for our communities moving forward?
Sure, thanks, Greg. So I think, at a really basic level, data equity is the only way our students from our communities are going to be impacted and included in conversations about racial justice and equity in higher education, because they've been left out of it for far too long. And so it's really important to see these disparities once you are able to look into the data at a deeper level. And I think also this identification of NHPI students and the particular struggles our students are facing, like Sina mentioned, in the states where populations are going up the most, not even having data to identify who on your campus might be struggling in certain ways is really, really proving to be a significant barrier. And then I'd say that institutional partnerships that are actually doing good work, good data work, and really looking at their student data through a culture of inquiry should be lifted up. Because 100%, we absolutely want to improve data collection mechanisms like Fafsa at the federal level. And I think we also want to look to institutions like Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions, ANAPCs, who are doing this work and are able to actually look at their data in a way that we would want to lift up, right, to the federal government. It's not lost on me that, UNLV is an ANAPC, R1, right? And they are able to identify this undercounting phenomenon of NHPI students. So from our perspective, we'd like to make that standard practice and certainly enable institutions to learn from each other, even independent of what federal standards might be.
Thanks, Julie. Karthik, you both have been in this game for a minute. You know the wariness that we sometimes carry when it comes to fighting for data equity. It feels like we're on the precipice or even starting a real breakthrough here, right? Like today, just alone, with the amount of information that's been shared, the dialogue that's had, the path forward that we see, it feels exciting. And so I'm curious from you, your thoughts and your perspective on this moment and sort of how you're feeling. Kam, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. I think we've seen improvements in data collection over most administrations, small increments. And under the Obama administration, there were the Asian American Pacific Islander data disaggregation grants out of OELA at Department of Education, and those were instrumental in helping a number of states disaggregate their student data. Minnesota, Rhode Island, Washington State, and we've seen that sort of spread increased support for the issue. So we're seeing places like New York, Portland and Oregon disaggregating their student data. And one of the great things about the state's data disaggregation is that they explicitly are including Southeast Asian students, Cambodian, Hmong, Lao, Vietnamese students, along with other populations as well, including NHPI students. I'm hopeful that this administration is, going to really take charge in making sure that data collection, analysis, and reporting is equitable. I think the president's executive order, the agency's equity plans, and the working group's plan have been very thoughtful and something that we're excited about. I think we haven't seen this level of momentum in, not since the D2 grants, and then before that, probably not for like 10 years. I think we are also extremely excited to see what's going to happen with the FAFSA. I think Southeast Asian American communities, you know, have continuously had issues in the education space when it comes to getting our community's information. And you know, FAFSA isn't the only answer for our communities, especially because 30% of our students aren't graduating from high school. But you know, it goes a long ways in terms of helping us have a better understanding of the financial needs of our students. You know, I think the other thing that we are excited about is just the more intentional efforts at HHS as well and CDC to collect better information. You know, I think in Minnesota, you know, our partners at the Coalition of Asian American Leaders have reported out that 49% of all Asian American deaths because of COVID are Hmong and other Southeast Asian populations. So we know that there is a disproportionate impact on Southeast Asian American communities, and we know that states are thirsty and hungry to disaggregate their work, but need more support from the federal government. And it's really great to see the Biden-Harris administration taking such a strong leap to move this issue forward.
So I'll add some thoughts here. First of all, just it was so great to see the current population survey. I built a good part of my dissertation on the current population survey and its data on civic engagement. One thing I'll note about the current population survey, with the tool that they have during the pandemic, I mean, we saw the labor force participation rate for all Asians. If you looked at the unemployment rate among Vietnamese Americans, you actually saw a spike in the early months of the pandemic because personal services were greatly affected by the pandemic. And we know from other occupational data from the CPS as well as other data sources that Vietnamese Americans are over-indexed when it comes to personal services like nail salons. So that, you know, I think shows you how critical and important it is to be able to try to disaggregate these data. It's heartening to see from OMB that there's additional funding requests for the National Health Interview Survey as well as other data. I'm hopeful that with the housing data, especially with the housing surveys, and as well as other data collections, that we are able to get more resources to enable this to happen. We knew, for example, with some of the work that CRAC and others had done, with very limited data, that the foreclosure crisis disproportionately affected Southeast Asian populations, but they had to get creative in terms of trying to pull together that information. Why is this important? Because again, with the kind of minority framing or homogenizing, people think, oh, you look at the race numbers and it looks fine. But the way this pinches in particular communities by geography, by detailed origin is something that we need to push towards. So that gives me hope, Greg, in terms of the kind of things we heard today, but I think still where we need to go. With what OMB said about money, I think I'll just end by saying a few things. I think what we need in terms of advancing this work is money. And we heard some hopeful things today, and hopefully we can continue to get those investments. Relationships, the kind of relationships that got many of us here today, but hopefully we can deepen them with things like the IPA. And I'm not talking about the beverage here, but the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, and if we can do more to get folks within government agencies. The kind of commitments we've heard here, I think, also give me hope. People talk about public-private partnerships. One of the things we do at the Center for Social Innovation is try to come up with new frameworks. So we've come up with one that's not just PPP, but PPCTP, which is public-private community tribal partnerships, to recognize the importance here, especially with tribal communities that are not quite the same as traditionally what we think of as governments, but to explicitly flag community, because a lot of times when people think of private, they think about corporations, they think about foundations. They don't explicitly think about community organizations that have subject matter expertise and population expertise. And then finally, we need to come at this with the spirit of innovation. There are a lot of stereotypes that government is probably one of the last places you would think about as innovators, but we've heard inspiring examples today about being able to move fast, to get the resources in order to innovate. Certainly COVID prompted many of us to do it, including government agencies. And that gives me hope in terms of where we'll be a year from now, 2 years from now, and 3 years from now.
I think the point about money that Karthik just made was beautifully put. I'll frame it a little bit differently. Look, nobody enjoys the spending money part about buying a new car. Nobody likes that part. But once they've got the new car, most of us, if not all of us, feel pretty good driving around a new car. Many of us feel better knowing that our car is probably better for the environment, and probably many of us feel better knowing our families are safer rolling in it. And to me, data equity is very similar. It's going to cost money up front, but investing in it now and being able to propel our data infrastructure at the federal level to account for the diversity of our communities, it's incredibly important. Like, this is the time to do it. I'm going to put Sina on the spot one last time, because when we talk about data equity and we talk about the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, far too often we forget to include Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. It's something we talk about internally all the time. And this is really a plea to our friends who are still in the audience from federal agencies. When you're thinking about how you expand data equity, when you think about expanding racial equity, and when you think about our communities, make sure that Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders include Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So Sina, again, for data equity, for EPIC, for your community, for you, what does this all really mean?
Thanks for the question, Greg. That's a great question. I think for the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community, in terms of the work that EPIC does, but not only EPIC, but many of our partners, not just in California, but across the country, is really making sure that we have a seat at the table, that we are heard, that we are seen, that we have so much to offer, because it makes no sense to me when I hear things about data on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders deemed as statistically insignificant, when that's not what I see in my community. Because especially during the pandemic, especially during when 2020 hit with COVID, many of our community leaders really rallied together and came together in many different states and demanded data disaggregation in their local counties and at the state level as well. And so if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have the data that we needed, especially to advocate for the resources that we need, especially as one of the most impacted communities by COVID. So I think that sums it up of how I see data equity working, and I really appreciate the opportunity that EPIC has been given to work at the national level and be invited by many of our partners to work together towards this.
Thank you, Sina. And I think that's a good place to end this panel, right? It really is important to hear these voices and, again, take into account these perspectives that have been historically overlooked for a very long time. So I'd like to thank our panelists and ask them to return to their seats, and we can close this thing. So we've made it. We've had a fantastic conversation today, and I just, again, like to thank our government panel for sharing their perspectives and all the work that they're doing. We look forward to keeping in touch with them. I want to take a moment also to thank Crystal, Erica, Howard O, and the White House Office of Public Engagement. This summit wouldn't have been possible without them. And I'd like to also say that while data disaggregation and data equity may be one of the single most important issues for our community, we are not a single issue community or constituency, right? And CAPA, our members, through our members and our partners as well, we work on issues that span across every policy area, and we continue to believe that our community deserves a seat at the table whenever any agency in this federal government is having a substantive policy conversation and how it impacts communities of color. So again, data disaggregation is incredibly important, but it shouldn't be the only table that we sit at. I will close again in saying that with the joint report that we did with API Data on data equity, with the report or the recommendations put out by the Equitable Data Working Group, job's not done. We know that these are important benchmarks, but we also know that it's going to take a lot of work on all of our parts in partnership with our friends in the government to make sure this really gets pushed across the finish line. We certainly recognize that there are many challenges that we all face and that agencies have to respond to, but we're immensely grateful for the opportunity to really do something substantive here and really propel this conversation forward. So on behalf of NCAPA and all of our member organizations, I thank you, and I'd like to call up to the podium Karthik to close.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone who've been here in person with us as well as tuning online, and many more who will see these remarks in the months and maybe even years to come. This is a very special moment, and just deep gratitude to the Biden administration for making racial equity a top priority on the first day of office and for establishing the Equitable Data Working Group. So many of us in the room recognize the deep connection between data and the work of equity. To see that recognized at the highest levels of the government is something else. And to see that it's not just words, but actions that are following through on that makes it even stronger. Just so honored to be with you all today. Greg and NCAPA, the team at NCAPA, including all the coalition members, it's been an honor and a privilege over the years to deepen our relationships, and it seems that our wins keep getting bigger over time. This is the third data summit that we've done in collaboration with community organizations, and we hope there are many more to come. I would also like to thank Erica at the White House, as well as Crystal from the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and I'm glad to welcome Crystal to the podium.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you, Greg. We're so grateful to all of our speakers today, our federal officials, as well as our community leaders who spoke so eloquently about the needs within our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, but also the tremendous work that is being done, as well as the work that we still have ahead. And so we are just so grateful through the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders to have been able to co-host today's Data Equity Summit along with NCAPA, API Data, as well as through our partnership with the CDC Foundation. We know that this is just the first of many ongoing conversations about the need to ensure that equity is truly embedded throughout the entirety of our federal government. In fact, throughout the month of May, during Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, WIAMPI has held a series of equity events focused on everything from educational and economic equity to health equity to combating anti-Asian racism and hate. And so we know that there is still so much work to do. We're very glad to be concluding our equity series on this very important topic of data equity, because we know that without the data, if we continue to be invisible in our federal data, we will never truly get to advancing equity, justice, and opportunity for our diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. So all of you are a partner in that front. We're so grateful again to those of you who are tuning in virtually, as well as those of us here in the room today who are able to share so much of the incredible work that is being done, as well as the strong commitment to advance equity for all of our communities. I do want to say, just really quickly, do a last minute plug. On Thursday, the White House Initiative and the White House Office of Public Engagement will be hosting our closing ceremony for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We will be doing that in person at the U.S. Department of Interior. So we do hope that those of you who are local to the D.C. Area will be able to join us. And then we will also be live streaming that for those to watch all across the country as well. So thank you so much again to everyone here. I also want to give a really quick shout out to so many of the staff behind the scenes who helped to make this event possible. Our White House Initiative Deputy Director, Rebecca Lee, Lan Shi from our team, as well as so many others who helped to make this work possible. So thank you again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.